As I mentioned in the last section of notes, Truman really pushed a really progressive agenda domestically. And if we look back to World War I, in the years following that war, by 1920, the American people were pushing for a return to normalcy, a return to isolationism. But in the years following World War II, there is no return to normalcy. Truman is pushing a really aggressive agenda at home with domestic policy, but he was also pushing a really aggressive agenda outside of the United States as well. And just like following World War I, after World War II, we have a very strong, even stronger than following World War I, anti-communist crusade or Red Scare. National security used anti-communism or fears of communism as a reason for developing more weapons, for creating more overseas bases, for undergoing massive government projects like the highway system, and really attacked a culture of secrecy and dishonesty, creating a really sharp line between what was American and what was not. So anyone who was linked to communism in those post-war years was seen as an enemy to freedom. And these things start really quickly. In 1947, the federal government starts a loyalty review system where they investigated federal employees. The House in the 1940s creates the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC is kind of what it was known, that held hearings on communist informants in Hollywood. They called in 10 unfriendly witnesses. They called in a number of witnesses, but 10 were known as unfriendly witnesses who refused to answer questions. They were charged with contempt of Congress, and many of them served time. And there's a number of other spy trials that are happening. Anybody who is accused of being a spy fueled this growing anti-communist hysteria. A guy by the name of Alger Hiss was accused of being a Soviet informant. He was convicted of perjury, served 5 years in prison. The most sensational of these trials, though, was Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were accused of passing secrets of the atomic bomb to the Soviets. They were convicted of that crime and were sentenced to death, and that was carried out in 1953. The Rosenbergs were spies, but them being convicted reinforced the idea that there were communists working inside the government. And so this led to a senator, a guy by the name of Joseph McCarthy, to kind of go on a crusade. And this crusade that he goes on gets the name of McCarthyism. And McCarthy comes out and says that he had a list of 205 communists who were working in the State Department, and using his power as a senator, used his Senate subcommittee to hold hearings and level charges against many. And he had a lot of support in the beginning. But as his accusations continued on, he sees a downfall by 1954. When he starts investigating the army, and he starts to come off as a bully, starts to make accusations without a lot of evidence, and he eventually becomes condemned by the Senate. And after this, McCarthyism becomes synonymous with an abuse of power and character assassination. But the anti-communist crusade created an atmosphere of fear. As much local as it was national, states had their own committees like HUAC. They required loyalty oaths, prevented people from joining civic organizations or legions, or like things like Daughters of the American Revolution. Libraries were forced to remove un-American books like Robin Hood, who took from the rich and gave to the poor. Not a very capitalist thing to do. So books like that were removed from American libraries. There were undoubtedly spies, and historians agree that there were spies in the post-war years. But most of the people who were convicted during the Red Scare were not spies. But the FBI used the Red Scare to expand their power and started to develop files on thousands of people. And so this Red Scare starts to impact in a number of different ways politics and even post-war culture. Republicans used anti-communist rhetoric, like things saying it was socialist, to block programs from Truman's Fair Deal. You see the passage of the McCarran-Walter Act in 1952 that kept immigration and quotas in place and authorized deportations if someone was identified as a communist. In 1954, the government launched Operation Wetback, which had raids on Mexican-American neighborhoods where they would basically round up and deport illegal aliens. Over 1 million workers, Mexican workers in the United States who had come over here for the Bracero program were now deported from the United States. And these battles about communists led to organized labor to remove really some of the best organizers that they had. And that really hurts the union movement in the United States. And unions actually start to support Cold War efforts. And so unions had primarily been involved in manufacturing, and in the post-war years, especially as we get later into the post-war years, when we're talking about like 1960s, 1970s, you really see the United States economy start to shift from manufacturing to service, and they're not able to get into those service sectors, which is why we don't have unions for waitresses and waiters and any other kind of service jobs that exist, because some of the best organizers that unions had were somewhat extreme. And because unions started to get more involved in Cold War efforts, they didn't want to be associated with communism. And certainly then with the rise of the civil rights movement, when you're removing most of your kind of more liberal thinkers, socialist thinkers, they're not allowed to have as much prominence, and they're not able to kind of attack new challenges as they get into the 1960s and the 1970s. Many leaders felt just compelled to support Cold War programs. And so, like I said, you see this shift of thinking and organizing where they use the language of the Cold War for their own purposes. And that image of racial equality that was being pushed forward really played right into Russian hands.